Hello, and welcome to the Arts Are Education Talk It Up podcast, where we talk to national, state, and local leaders who are working to make arts education part of every student's life. I'm Jim Palmarini, your host. Arts Are Education is a project sponsored by the National Coalition for Core Arts Standards, NCAS, is a collaboration of 8 national arts and arts education organizations who actively work to ensure quality, standards-based arts education opportunities for every student. So today, we are going to talk about arts education data, current trends and initiatives in the field, and the story they tell about arts education, why this data is so important. So to move forward with this discussion, I'm joined today by 2 arts education leaders, Jamie Kasper, Director, Arts Education at Education Commission of the States, Arts Education Partnership with the Education Commission of the States, and Claus von Zastrow, Principal for the Education Commission of the States. Welcome, Jamie, and welcome, Claus. If you could unmute and say hello.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thanks, Jim.
Hello. Thanks so much for being here. So before we get started with our questions about data, could you just each respectively tell our audience about the work that the Arts Education Partnership does, and also the work that the Education Commission of the States does, and the connection between the two? So Claus, to you.
Sure. So I'm the Senior Policy Director at Education Commission of the States, where we really help state leaders make better education policy. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works with people from governor's offices to state departments of education to state school boards to legislatures and to others to ensure that they all have the kinds of information, context, and guidance they need to ensure that students are all getting the best possible education they could.
Great. I consider the commission the go-to organization that is so important across all of education. So thank you for the work that you and your colleagues do. Jamie?
Yeah, Arts Education Partnership is part of Education Commission of the States, and AEP was formed in 1995 through a partnership between the National Endowment for the Arts, U.S. Department of Education, and we've been part of ECS since 2015. AEP's strategic mission as a program within ECS is to build leadership capacity for arts and education leaders. So a little bit of a narrower focus than ECS, but we do collaborate a lot with our ECS colleagues like Klaus.
And let me just say, full disclosure, I serve on the advisory board of the Arts Education Partnership, and it has been one of the most fruitful organizations that I have been fortunate enough to work with. So thank you for everything that the partnership has done all these years. So at that, let's get started. So, there's a great line in your 2022 update of your 2021 AEP blog about arts education data, which I thought might be kind of a way into our conversation. I tweaked it a little bit. So it's this: we need to learn from what we know and what we don't know. So for the data uninitiated, could you kind of explain what that all means?
Yeah, I can. Yeah. I can start there, Jim. So learning from what we know and what we don't know means that even if there isn't data, that's still information, right? All information is knowledge, including a lack of information or a lack of data. So as an example, in the arts education data space, we know that no states currently collect or report data about student experience with teaching artists, for example. And that in and of itself gives us information. And in this case, information about states' priorities, what supports exist or don't exist for collecting and reporting data. These missing data points can also help us to craft questions that we can explore as we do more work in arts and data. For example, using the teaching artist piece above, a question that might guide future data work in teaching artist experience is, how much time do teaching artists spend in schools? Right, that is a question that then we could explore using arts education data.
Claus, follow up?
Yeah, I mean, I really don't have much to add to what Jamie said there. You know, very often you know, you can see where people's priorities lie, as she said, by seeing what data they collect and what they don't. But you can also, I think, understand what's difficult to understand through data collection by seeing what they collect and what they don't. And some things are very, very difficult to collect with data. And sometimes it's helpful to have conversations about what is difficult to collect and why.
Well, it also makes me think a little bit about priorities sometimes, you know, because my background is theater, and those of us in the field feel there's not enough data collection around theater. Just one point. So here is another 101 question about data. What is baseline data? We hear this term all the time, and why is it so important for K-12 arts education?
Well, you know, I guess I could take that one. Baseline data is basically a way that you find a starting point from which you can measure changes against that starting point. And so this becomes really important if you want to determine the impact of a big event, you know, a big event like, you know, in this case, we could say the pandemic. And if we have a baseline, and let's take this example of the pandemic, I know we're going to be talking about it a little bit more. The baseline in that case would be sort of data from the 2019-2020 school year, right? Because those were data that, at least usually when they got collected, they would have been collected before the pandemic happened. So that gives you a sense of what things were like before this big event. And then if you can look at data from the subsequent years, you can track against that baseline to see what kinds of changes we've experienced. And that becomes very, very important. Without those baseline data, we end up just speculating, even if we have data for the most recent year. And that also becomes really important for other things, like if you're putting into place some new policies, or you have no new programmatic efforts or new things that you're doing that you think are going to have a big impact. It's really good to have baseline data before you put those things into place. And that way you can begin to see whether there's been a change. Now, researchers will tell you that you also have to do other things, like you have to figure out which variables are most likely to have affected the data, you know, and make sure that you can get rid of what they call confounding variables. So it's not, you know, there's a lot of science and art to this effort, but without baseline data, you can't do any of it.
Yeah, I think that it's the sort of thing that gets data researchers really excited to talk about baseline data. You got to start someplace, and I think that's true right now as we're moving in through the pandemic. We are really excited about finding out how things have changed, and we have that baseline, as you said. Jamie, anything else to add?
One thing I would add is, you know, I know pandemic is front of mind for many of us, but we've had lots of events over the last years. One that comes to mind is the passage of No Child Left Behind, you know, and Bob Sable, another member of the Arts Our Education crew. Bob Sable published a report a number of years ago about the effects of No Child Left Behind, specifically on visual arts educators. And the reason he was able to do that, or sorry, visual arts education more broadly, the reason Bob was able to do that is because we had a baseline of data before No Child Left Behind came into play that then allowed him to do some analysis of the effect of that policy on visual arts education.
Let's talk about what I'm calling the twin pillars of K-12 arts ed data that are so much in the forefront today. That's the National Arts Education Data Project, led by Bob Morrison, and the State Data Infrastructure Project, affectionately known as SDIP. So what are these, and what role are they playing in this effort to track and communicate arts data?
Well, maybe should I start with this one, Jamie? So these are, it's very interesting that you present them as pillars, because I think they are pillars because they're both sort of lifting the same weight in common. Really, Quadrant Research and the work that they've been doing with the Arts Education Data Project has been to work with states to help those states take data they already collect as a matter of course, right? These are data that they have collected just in the process of getting data on school enrollments and what kinds of things students are taking and transcript data and all this stuff that so many states, in fact, the large majority of states already collect but haven't published. And so Quadrant Research has worked, I think it's with CDAE together, to help states actually analyze and publish that information so that people can actually see, well, how many students were in schools that offered arts education? Could we break that down by the different disciplines in the arts? Can we figure out which student groups might have different kinds of access? And then how many students and what share of students are actually taking those arts classes? So those are data that were kind of unlocked, that hadn't been collected for that express purpose, but are very useful for that purpose. And the blog you made reference to earlier shows a lot of the states that have recently released data through the Arts Education Data Project, in Quadrant Research's efforts. SDIP, right, the State Data Infrastructure Project for Arts Education, really has taken a complementary approach. And really what SDIP has tried to do is to create a set of tools and resources to help more people understand how one even goes about this work. And I should say that the State Data Infrastructure Project for Arts Education was a collaboration between the National Endowment for the Arts and Education Commission of the States. And we presented a number of tools and resources people could use so that they can understand what it takes to do this kind of work. We created, among other things, a toolkit. And the toolkit sort of takes you by the hand anywhere from figuring out what kinds of questions you even want to ask to going through the process of making data requests and analyzing data and all of that. And one really important lesson of the toolkit is that very often you need partners, unless you have a data license and some really good analytical software, you need partners either
We are frozen. Are you there, Jamie?
I'm here. I think we may have lost Klaus. Oh, there he is. You're back, Klaus.
Back.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I freeze?
You were stunned for just a moment. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know if I don't know where you lost me, but basically my point being is there are tools that exist now to make this much easier than it ever has been.
A couple of things about what you said is to point out, you talked about partners and you mentioned CDAE. The long reference there is the State Education Directors of Arts Education. I might have got the acronym slightly wrong, but the point is those are across the states. Those are the people at the Departments of Education who are critical to communicating to leaders and to right down to teachers about the value of arts education and supporting that. And they play such a critical role in, I think, this data effort. And what I love about the SDIP, and I worked a little bit, I think, with you, with the NEA initiative on that committee, is that it empowers anyone really with the initiative and really sophisticated software to go after that data. It's interesting, I think, that some states are more on top of that data than others. There are places in the world, I suppose, that use 3x5 cards, but that's getting better. So, Jamie, do you have some other thoughts to add about the work, maybe to the data project, which I also love because you can spend hours digging down into that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the only thing I would add about the Arts Education Data Project, since Klaus talked so much about the SDIP, is, Quadrant, as Klaus mentioned, has been working really closely with CDAE, because what Quadrant is doing is taking those state level data that are available. And this is something that came out of the SDIP work. States are collecting a lot of data and just sometimes those aren't reported.
Right.
So what the Arts Education Data Project has been doing is helping the CDAE folks in each state get access to those data and pull them into a dashboard that is customized for that state, but also has some comparisons across states or has some commonalities across states. So I really see them not as competing efforts or as efforts that are, duplicating things, but as efforts that are working hand in hand to help us understand what's happening in each state related to data collection. That's SDIP. And then the Arts Education Data Project is helping folks get access to and report on those data.
So it goes back to the whole twin pillar thing. And it's interesting in the last couple of years how much richer the data has become, the individual criteria that is now offered that wasn't necessarily available a few years ago, in courses or across ethnicity and so forth. So fascinating and really wonderful work. So I want to get back to that a little bit when we talk about comparison, but for a second, let's talk about the National Assessment of Educational Project, NAEP, otherwise known as the Nation's Report Card. We just saw one come out in reading and math that people got really excited about in a good and not so good way. NAEP has been pulled back for the arts. The National Assessment Governing Board, who manages NAEP, dropped dance and theater from the NAEP calendar many years ago in 2008. And then more recently, they dropped arts and music in 2019. What are we losing in terms of access and information now that the arts NAEP is no longer around? Jamie?
Yeah. So I want to back up just a second and talk about, we've been talking about data, specifically access data and teacher data, right? That's the SDIP work and that's the Arts Education Data Project work, but that work does not include information about student learning. That is what NAEP has done for us over the years. And again, those are not the same, but they are complementary. And those two things together, access data and teacher data, and then this assessment and student learning data, those things work together to give us a polar picture of arts learning across the country. And that's why it's really important to have both of those kinds of data. So when NAEP took the arts off of their assessment calendar in those 2 years, Jim, you mentioned 2008 and then 2019, what we lost access to is a national level and really the only national level look at learning in the arts. And we lost something really important, which is longitudinal data, right? We have baseline data about arts learning from NAEP from many, many years ago. And every time that the assessment was done again, we got more data to allow us to track over time. And we've lost that. We've lost that longitudinal data. The other thing that we've lost is a model. NAEP was really a model for how do we take a combination of multiple choice test items, which I know a lot of educators really don't feel comfortable with in the arts because it's really hard to assess learning via multiple choice items. And NAEP took multiple choice items, which are quick and relatively easy and cheap to score, blended with performance tasks. And performance tasks were scored by trained educators. And it is a lot more time consuming and a lot more expensive to do those performance tasks and to score those performance tasks. But together, they give us a really, really good sense of what students are authentically learning in the arts. And so we've lost that model as NAEP was pulled off of the calendar.
So I have to ask, and then I want to hear from you, Claus. Maybe this is the obvious point, is why is it so important that we understand arts learning? How can that impact the place of arts education in the curriculum? That's a big question, I suppose.
It is a big question. I will start to answer it, and then we'll see if Claus has anything to add. But I think number one, information about arts learning is really important because I think there are still people across the country who don't understand that the arts are about learning. The arts are not about entertainment. They are not about, putting children on a stage or children's works in a gallery and having them perform for the community. They are about learning. Arts education is about learning. It is not about performance and entertainment. And what NAEP allowed us to do is to put our stake in the ground and say, the arts education is about learning, and we can assess that learning, and this is how we do it. Claus, anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I could add to that is that it's about learning, and it's about understanding also then sort of the mechanisms that create learning. Without that kind of deeper look into what's going on, there are limitations. So as we noted, a lot of these really good arts education data projects that are happening right now give us some information about access and participation, but we don't know participation in what. And so it makes it much harder then, for example, if, in other disciplines where we have maybe more information, it's easier to do research on what works and what doesn't. Yeah. But as long as we're not assessing or have some kind of a framework for what it even looks like when it works, it leaves researchers and people who want to improve the field with less information than they really need.
So this question, in some ways, I think we've sort of addressed this, but speaking very generally regarding data about arts education, how have things changed in the past year or so in how and what states have collected as compared to a few years ago? Again, I think we kind of addressed this, but let's just visit it one more time. Jamie?
Yeah, I can start. The blog post that Claus and I wrote in May of 2021 right. With our colleague Zeke was a pretty comprehensive look at where arts education stood at that moment, as we were kind of in the throes of the pandemic, and we didn't know what the world was going to look like. We still don't know what the world is going to look like moving forward. We wrote that blog because we attempted to answer the question, how has access to arts education changed since the pandemic began? And we quickly realized that the answer is we don't know, and we can't know because, data aren't collected or data aren't reported in every state. Data that are reported aren't defined the same. So that was kind of our baseline, and then we've updated it just now. And what we found in that update is we had 24 states who were reporting statewide arts education data in May of 2021. Now we have 28 states. So Delaware, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island are now added to that list. And what we've really found is that how states are collecting data hasn't really changed. And I would say, as someone who was the CDA person in Pennsylvania many years ago, state level government moves very slowly. It moves very slowly because, making quick decisions often means that we're not using taxpayer dollars effectively. Mm-hmm. There are lots of checks and balances to make sure that we're serving as many people as well as possible. And so when we talk about state level data collection, we're talking about changes to very large, very long-standing government systems that purposely move slowly so that we have lots of checks and balances. And that means that in the year and a half since we did that initial blog post, we haven't seen changes because those systems move so slowly, and they move slowly on purpose. Again, so we're not making knee-jerk decisions and reactions that might not be the best use of taxpayer dollars.
So, Claus, this almost leads directly into our next question. So we have all these states, 28 states that are gathering data. Nevertheless, why is it difficult to tell a really broad, insightful, consistent story about these arts disciplines across the United States with what we do have?
Yeah, which is true. Even with those 28 states, or that give us data, each state, and this is not a bad thing, but each state has different needs, different systems, different assumptions that they use when they collect data. So, for example, just to take a simple example, a state might define the term enrollment quite differently, right? When do you define enrollment? Does that happen halfway through the term? Does it happen if the students actually complete a course? Does it happen at the beginning of the term? So those things make a difference, and those things are very much key to specific needs the state might have, or specific assumptions they have about, whether they're really focused on course completion as opposed to getting kids into courses or whatever. So these differences then make it very difficult to say that state A is comparable to state B on some things. Some states that release data didn't release data for elementary, age kids, because obviously the whole question of what it means to take an art class might be a little more complicated. And so even their definitions of what it meant to be enrolled in an arts class could be quite different and not comparable. And so this is not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, we can't expect states all to decide to standardize. I mean, that's not how things happen in our country, because people are being responsive to their own constituents, their own populations, and their own needs. But it does create a data challenge. It does make it difficult to say, hey, state A is really knocking it out of the park, and state B could really stand to learn from state A, because it might be that some of these definitional changes or other assumptions are driving those differences. To the point that Jamie was talking about earlier, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, what that did do is it gave us a comparison tool at like a national view. It wasn't so much a comparison because they couldn't do things at the state level. An absolute pipe dream would be if the National Assessment of Educational Progress could actually do that assessment with enough kids so that you could get state level results, right? Because they do that in mathematics and in reading, for example, and that allows you then to make comparisons that really are comparable. But the fact is that that's very unlikely to happen. It would be extraordinarily expensive. So what we can do is we can try to sort of eyeball things and get some sense of patterns across states, but always we have to be cautious about deciding that we have a national picture because most of the states have released their data. We have a picture of states in the nation, which can add up to something, some sense of a broader national perspective, but always with caution.
So let's talk about the impact of the pandemic a little bit on arts education. So as we begin to know more and more about arts access to during the pandemic, baseline again, do we have solid baseline data about access before the pandemic, I guess 2018 and 19, maybe before that are going to help us do some comparisons, even if it's state by state or district by district, to get some sense of what the impact has been. There's a discussion, there was following the NAEP test on 9-year-olds, talking about reading and math scores. Personally, I think there is such a thing as learning loss in the arts. For example, is that something that we're going to be able to take a look at in any meaningful way? Maybe that's 2 questions, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, happy to do it. As the first question, whether there is baseline data, the answer is it depends on the state.
Yeah.
That blog posting that Jamie and our colleague Zeke and I did in 2021 and now have refreshed for this year will give you insight into the states that have data, and you'll see that those states, most of them, published pre-pandemic data. I would say all of them did, but most of them published data even in 2018, 2019, or 2019, 2020, which many people could take as like the last pre-pandemic year, because most of those data were collected before the pandemic hit. So the reality is that most other states that haven't published data already have those data. It's what we were referring to before. These were things that most states collected as a matter of course. So you could actually analyze things in retrospect, or like analyze what happened in prior years and present those data. So it's not like those data don't exist. They do in close to all of the cases. It just requires that level of analysis. As that second question that you had embedded, can we see any changes right now? That was the second question?
Yeah, that is the question. And basically, what have we? I've used 2 questions here. What have we learned so far, I guess, is.
Yeah, and of course I've starting with baselines, I always think of that in terms of change, right? Since the data
Right.
we have tell us about access and enrollment primarily,
Right.
we can see increases or decreases. And right now, the picture is quite incomplete because there's still a lot of states that haven't released new data since, that would be later than the pandemic. Those that have, there's some states that released data for 2020, 2021, when I think it's fair to say that was the first year where we would really be able to register the impact of the pandemic, and also 2021, 2022. And so those include Arizona, Delaware, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And I hope people don't think they have to take notes on that, because you can just visit that blog posting we've referred to and you'll see it all there. And so what we're seeing is a somewhat mixed picture. In Delaware, for example, which released the most recent data, 2021, 2022, which was last school year, there does seem to have been a dip in 2020, 2021, when the pandemic was really hitting full force, followed by a moderate rebound. And in Florida, for example, enrollment in music and visual arts appeared to be higher in the 2021-2022 school year than it had been in 2019-2020, which, is interesting and could warrant some further exploration. But there were other states, where you could see that there was a definite decline between 2019, 2020, right before the pandemic, and 2020, 2021, when we're in the thick of the pandemic. And those are states like Arizona, Georgia, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. So it's not surprising. And it's not surprising. Schools were shuttered, all kinds of things were going on. If anything, the declines that we see in the data might understate what was actually going on, because that's where that definition of enrollment becomes especially important. I sat here and I watched my own daughter enrolled in art and music classes. And I have to say, her teachers were incredibly innovative in how they were able to deal with this when they didn't have access to facilities. That said, it was impossible to give students the same kind of experience. So that enrollment, even with what looks like modest declines in some states, might actually be masking much deeper declines. This goes back to Jamie's earlier point. There's a level of what's going on in the classroom, of quality, of what we consider to be really sound arts instruction, that we can't uncover through these data. But these data can give us that first bit of important evidence that allows us to ask those further questions.
That is so insightful, Claus, because Jamie, I want to hear from you, because it makes me think about, with some caution when we're talking about all of this data, how individual groups of advocates, administrators, policymakers, and educators should actually think about what this data really means to them for arts education. So I'm just going to open that up. Jamie, go ahead. What are your thoughts?
I think there are a couple of things that come to mind when I think about this. One is, there's a baseline of caring about arts education that has to be present in all of those groups that you mentioned, Jim. People have to care about arts as an important part of a child's learning experience. That has to be present before we start to look at any kind of data, because in some of these cases, we need to dig further, and that digging isn't going to happen if folks don't care about the arts as an important part of learning. The second thing is that storytelling becomes awfully important. Once we have those baseline data that Claus mentioned, and once we were able to ask some questions and dig further and see if answers to those questions are available, and if they are, then we've got to extract the story from all of those pieces of information and tell the truest story that we possibly can about both groups of children and then individual children and the experiences they're having. So Klaus's story about his daughter's experience is actually another data point. It's just that these data systems that we're talking about are not meant to capture those individual stories. So we have to do a little bit more work as folks in the arts education field to really tell that story of those data.
So and I want to hear from you again, Claus, but this actually leads directly into one more question here, which was about whether during the pandemic or before or after, students' access to arts outside the school day, both before and during the pandemic, either through extracurricular, after school activities, or in the community. I'll speak again for theater, after school rehearsal, in productions, or for musicians, I think any kind of rehearsal and performative work, there's no data that has tracked that. And I think it becomes even more interesting because was there increased access during the pandemic for certain students and not for others? So, what are the barriers that really exist related to collecting and reporting on this sort of data? Claus?
Well, it's very difficult to get at data where there aren't systems already existing to collect it. And so we call often school system data or, state education data systems, we call them administrative data because they're administered often relatively centrally, with a budget to have this data system and all that, things that are lacking in the out of school space, which is informal and much more decentralized and all that. And there is a data point that's of some but not a ton of value I can talk about a little bit later. But anyway, I just wanted to register that point.
Jamie?
Yeah, I would say, Claus touched on it a little bit, but I want to underscore that most of the data that are collected in schools started being collected for areas that are not arts. And we just, as arts folks, we benefit from those systems that were set up to collect, those enrollment data and those educator data and those participation data. And, someone said, oh, the arts are also content areas, and we're gonna collect those data. Those content areas are not as dependent on the after school space and the community spaces as arts learning is. And so that's why we don't have those administrative data that Claus mentioned in those spaces, because the systems weren't set up. I would also want to make sure that we talk about the human beings in the after school and community spaces, because you cannot have data without people collecting and inputting them, right? There's no magic data fairy that just comes along and sprinkles their wand and the data go into the computer and then we magically have access to them. There are people behind every piece of information that we have access to. And in the after school and community spaces, those people are teaching, and those people are feeding and helping with homework and arranging for transportation home. And data is this huge behemoth that would require them to take time and effort away from those really crucial things that keep children safe and engaged in learning. So we would need to set up considerable systems of support so that those folks could continue to meet the needs of the children who are in their care before we ask them to also take on data collection and reporting.
I think it is so important that you pointed out the fact that there are people involved in this process, very busy people. And it does remind me of I can't remember who said it, about if only we could get the little critters to sit still. And then we would be able to do this. So I want to wrap up here in the next few minutes. I want to thank you both for your time. What are AEP's and ECS's plan to help further illuminate and expand K-12 arts education data collection in 2023? I know you both have some things in mind. Claus, you first, I guess.
And I'm absolutely going to defer a little bit later to Jamie. We're doing a lot of work in education data more broadly, and our hope is to help policymakers at the state level understand how data systems can work, what makes them most effective, and what makes them most effective for the broad diversity of audiences they serve, who have a broad diversity of questions. And in many ways, and I've made this point before, arts educators are at the vanguard of asking new questions of data systems and actually beginning to provide answers. And so there are a lot of non-arts educators who are looking at that. And so that's sort of part of the message that we're trying to impart. But I know that Jamie has some much more specific things on her agenda.
I do. So I mentioned at the top of the podcast that AEP was founded by the two federal agencies, National Endowment for the Arts, U.S. Department of Education, and they still are very large and very visible partners in our work. Every year, Education Commission of the State signs a cooperative agreement with the National Endowment for the Arts, and those two federal agencies work together to assign to AEP some focus areas that we're going to be working on for the next year. So for the first time ever this year, we have two new focus areas. Arts education data is one of them, and related, and probably not surprising to anyone, teacher recruitment and retention is our second new focus area. So when we talk about those arts educator data that are collected and reported in some states, I don't think we can have a data conversation without talking about educators as well. So that's going to shake down for us in a couple of different ways. One is we have 3 existing working groups within AEP. We have an equity working group, policy working group, and a partnerships with higher education working group. Next year, we're adding a 4th working group that is going to be focused on arts education data. We're going to convene for the first time in January, meet throughout the next year, and the goal is for that group by the end of next year to have a plan codified to really improve national data collection. So to build on the excellent work of the Arts Education Data Project and build on the excellent work of the state data infrastructure project in arts education, and really think about where do we go from here and how can AEP, harness the collective impact of our 180 partner and affiliate organizations to really move us forward in the field. So that's the new stuff. And we've got some existing stuff that will continue. Every year, AEP publishes ArtScan. It is our 50-state comparison of policies across the country in every state plus DC and the Department of Defense education activity. And so we will continue to publish those. Updates to ArtScan are published in March of every year. So March of 2023 will be the next one. And that gives us a good handle on what are the policies in every state? Which states have policies about, offering arts courses at each level? What are the certification requirements for non-arts educators, for example? Like in some states, there's a requirement that, sorry, it is now Friday. My brain just went boop. So let me take a moment to gather my thoughts and actually say this. In some states, there is a requirement that non-arts educators, specifically at the elementary level, have some kind of arts coursework in their teacher preparation programs. So those are the examples of policies that we are collecting information on and reporting information about. Whew, okay, Friday brain passed. We're now good to go.
All right, as we close, and let me just say, I am so excited that AEP is taking a leadership role in establishing this new committee. And I know it's going to be great work because there's so many great partners at the table. Claus, any final words of wisdom?
Sorry, I've got to unmute myself. No, I mean, I really think that if anything, it's just important for people to understand, and this, I think, just builds on Jamie's earlier remarks, that data are everywhere. They come in different forms. It doesn't always have to come out of a system, but it's very good to think in advance, what questions do you really need answers to? And then start asking yourself, how can I get those answers? And think of that before you start doing something really new and meaningful rather than after.
First, let me just say thank you, Jamie and Claus, for taking the time to talk to the arts or education audience. I think a lot of insightful things were said. Shameless plug, if you want to learn more, the first thing to know is that their follow-up blog to the 2021, What We Know About Arts Education 2021, there is a follow-up blog that I believe will appear in both the Arts Education Partnership site and the Arts Our Education site. What We Know About Arts Education 2 years later. It has all of the links to many of the things that we talked about today and some additional things really valuable. But to know, you can go to the Arts Education Partnership page and find out about a lot of different efforts and content that the partnership has created over the years. And also you can go to the ECS page. All of these links will be available on the Arts Our Education page. And also the Arts Education Data Project, I cannot urge our listeners enough to go to this site. It's open to anyone who wants to spend time digging down into their state, their district, their school, and to learn a lot of things. Arts Our Education is for everyone. So sign the pledge indicating your support. Urge your school boards to pass the resolution to fund arts education in the now, I would say, 2023-24 school year, because that's where we're moving towards, and donate to Arts Our Education to help us share the message at www.artsoureducation.org. So with that, Jamie, Claus, happy Friday. Have a great weekend. And thank you so much again. At that, we are signing off. Bye-bye.
Thank you.